Thank you for joining us to celebrate Stephen Heyman's fascinating biography of a complex and colorful literary figure and the founder of the organic farming movement, who we've never heard of. Stephen has elegantly revealed him in the deeply researched portrayal, The Planter of Modern Life, Louis Bromfield and the Seeds of the Food Revolution. Hello, I'm Stephanie Flom, Executive Director of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. Today's program is part of our Made Local series, produced in partnership with the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. Thank you to the library, as well as our independent bookstore partner, White Whale Bookstore, where you can purchase signed copies of Stephen's book. We are thrilled that Stephen is joined today with his friend and fellow Pittsburgh-based journalist Beth Kracklauer. Beth is the food editor at the Wall Street Journal. Prior to joining the Journal, she was the editor at Saveur, Gourmet, and other publications. Stephen Heyman has written for the New York Times, Slate, Vogue, and others. He is the recipient of a fellowship from the Leon Levy Center for Biography and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The reviews for The Planter of Modern Life are glowing. Quote, exemplary biography of a man whose life was a confounding series of paradoxes. Heyman applies keen narrative skills to tell the story of Brahman's celebrity-studded life. The result is a rattling good yarn. A splendid biography from which you will renew your faith in passion, integrity, and idealism. Please welcome Beth Kracklauer and Stephen Heyman.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi.
I'm so happy to be talking about this book with you because I have lots of questions about it. And, you know, for me personally, it was really revelatory because, you know, I'm a person who spent my whole career writing and editing stories about food and farming. And yet I was completely unaware of Bromfield. And I think I'm not alone in that. So I think it would be really helpful as a place to start for you to kind of sketch out the arc of his career or his various careers, which were all extraordinary.
Yeah. I was in your exact position 5 years ago. I had just moved to Pittsburgh. My wife came here for grad school, and I was looking for a story, and I happened to meet John and Suki Jameson, who raised lamb in the Laurel Highlands. And they had been inspired to become these kinds of like early adopters of sustainable agriculture back in the 1970s, I think it was, in part by reading Bromfield's books. I was interviewing John at his farm, and he just mentioned kind of offhandedly this guy. I wrote his name down in my notebook, came home, Googled him, and then dropped down to this marvelous rabbit hole where I discovered a farmer who had been extremely famous in mid-century America. E.B. White wrote an ode about his farm in the New Yorker magazine, and Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart got married there in 1945. And he was one of the earliest proponents of organic agriculture and a kind of environmental visionary. But he had also this extraordinary earlier life as a Pulitzer Prize-winning Lost Generation novelist, hanging out with Hemingway and Stein in Paris between the wars. So I was saying to myself, this is crazy that I don't know about this guy. B, how do these two kind of divergent identities fit together? And I thought perhaps there could be a book there. And that was the beginning of this nearly 5-year process that led to the book.
So we're here mainly to talk about him as a farmer, but I do have to say that, you know, he was such a massively popular novelist who I never read in my literature degree. And, you know, he was Gertrude Stein's favorite American novelist of the time.
Yes. So, you know, I think that has a lot to do with fashion and changing literary tastes. He was not at all part of the avant-garde, even though he hung out with people like that. You know, he was good friends with Hemingway. He attended parties at Ford Madox Ford's apartment in Paris. Bromfield wrote kind of conventional post-Victorian novels They're interesting. His first came out in 1924, The Green Bay Tree. It was an instant bestseller. His third book, Early Autumn, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1927. The books typically featured these kind of female protagonists, actually, who were trying to break free from their like stultifying Midwestern backgrounds. And usually they did this by reconnecting with the natural world or moving to Europe. But he was absolutely a best-selling novelist, probably better regarded by the mainstream critical establishment in the period than Hemingway or Fitzgerald. And the profits he got from writing these novels allowed him to live a kind of lavish existence in France between the wars. And anyways, it's interesting. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about his relationship with Ernest Hemingway.
Well, yeah, I mean, I got the sense a little bit from the book and from talking to you that there was a certain rivalry there, at least on Hemingway's part.
Absolutely. Hemingway was extremely jealous of Bromfield's success. He cozied up to him because Bromfield was better connected than him. You know, when they met in the fall of 1925, Hemingway was just a kind of ex-newspaperman trying to get his fiction career off the ground. Bromfield was kind of riding high, about to publish this third novel after two great successes. And he tried to get Hemingway a publisher for The Sun Also Rises. He kind of wined and dined him. He really enjoyed his company. And Hemingway, to Bromfield's face, complimented him. But behind his back, he wrote these vicious letters to Fitzgerald, mocking Bromfield for his kind of country gentleman airs. He went over to this house one time and was complaining about how Bromfield served him ordinary wine and how the cats were relieving themselves on the floor. Silly stuff, but it concealed a genuine kind of jealousy that Hemingway felt, and it came to the fore after Bromfield's won the Pulitzer, and Hemingway's own book, The Sun Also Rises, kind of got mixed reviews. In fact, his hometown newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, dismissed it as a bushel of sensationalism and triviality. So Hemingway pours out his frustration in one remarkable letter to his editor, Maxwell Perkins, and talks about how he cut 40,000 words from the manuscript of The Sun Also Rises, of material that he thought the critics expected. And he said it would have pleased them, but it would have rung as false 10 years from now as Bromfield. And this is kind of the moment where, in the book, Bromfield's, it becomes clear that for all the charm of Bromfield's novels, he was not a modernist. He was, when it came to literature, he would only be revealed as a kind of modernist later on when it came to his relationship with the land and with agriculture.
That's really fascinating. I mean, you talk in the book about how his story and your book are split into really two parts. There's the France part in the interwar years and his garden that he cultivated there, which I'd love it if you talk about a little bit next, and then his farming years in Ohio. He was this kind of, in addition to being quite powerful in literary circles, he was also a powerful personality. He was a tall, dashing man who was very magnetic to people. And so if you could set the scene a little bit for that garden he had outside of Paris and all of the people who came there and what he learned there.
Right. So unlike a lot of law generation writers who kind of settle on the left bank, Bromfield eventually moves to this town called Senlis, about 30 miles north of Paris. And he rents an old rectory, and begins to set out this amazing garden on like an acre alongside a river. And the garden becomes, I don't know, like a literary salon, and it attracts all kinds of writers and also celebrities, aristocrats, and through that garden, more so than through any kind of literary affinity, Bromfield develops two remarkable friendships in the late 1920s, early 1930s with Gertrude Stein and Edith Wharton. Now, I think this reveals how kind of charismatic he is in a way, and how Catholic he is in his taste for people, among other things, because Stein and Wharton are totally like diametrically opposed in style. Yes, they were both, American writers living in France, but Wharton is this kind of conservative, decorous figure, a bit fancy, and Stein is like this monument to modernism. They had nothing to do with each other, yet they found a lot to like, both of them, in Bromfield. And the interesting thing is they bonded over gardening. Stein and her partner, Alice B. Toklas, raised like herbs and vegetables in their summer home. And Wharton had grand gardens near Senlis in a town called Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt. And Bromfield and Wharton, exchanged cuttings and seeds, and they lunched with garden designers, and they visited flower breeders. Their relationship, it was almost incidental that they happened to be two Pulitzer Prize winning American novelists. They really were mostly talking about gardening when they hung out.
Wow, that's really interesting. And then the work of creating that garden, it was itself a very ambitious project. And he, I believe, began sort of learning about and developing a different relationship to an understanding of the role of the farmer vis-a-vis the land and the stewardship of the soil in particular. How did he do that?
Absolutely. Bromfield knew because of Roman ruins that had been dug up in this town. He actually dug up old bones when he was working in the garden, that the banks of these rivers had been inhabited and cultivated for thousands of years. And he was shocked that his neighbors' gardens and farms were more fertile through their care, at the end of all that time, and he was comparing the situation with what was happening in America. While he's pursuing this lovely life, taking tea in the garden with Edith Wharton, you have things like the Dust Bowl happening in America, the Great Depression, these incidents of widespread soil erosion. And also Bromfield comes from farming people. His grandfather lost his farm, and he knows about how difficult that farming life is, and the sight of a kind of exhausted, family farm is not at all alien to him. So he's trying to kind of like figure out, why is this land, after all its use, better? And back home, that's not at all the case. And I think it has everything to do with the kind of almost sacred relationship that his peasant neighbors had toward their soil, the way they composted, the way they, intercrops, where they planted different things, because they mutually benefited both crops. So a lot of different techniques he's learning, and he's becoming very absorbed in his garden, so much so that he confesses in one letter that he thinks he might end up a horticulturalist instead of a novelist.
Prescient. Because that is in fact sort of what happened, although very gradually over years, and for a long time he was both. If you could just sort of contrast that relationship with the soil and the understanding of the care for the soil with the way conventional farming was being done in the United States at that time.
Yeah, Bromfield later wrote that, farmers had essentially mined their land, and that they would exhaust the farmland and then move west. This was kind of like the story of American agriculture, and that left a trail of destruction. And so it was this this false belief that there's always better, more land elsewhere, and that we don't have to kind of take care of it, was exactly what Bromfield was fighting against when he began his crusade on the eve of World War II after coming back to America. He actually go ahead.
No, go on.
He actually said that he wanted to be the first in a new race of pioneers, not the sort that, burned the prairie and raped the land, but the sort that would heal, the land and restore it to the richness that, it had when the first settler landed, in America. So that was very much his orientation.
Yeah, that I definitely got that from the book. And he, I understand that he spent some time in India also during the 1930s. He wrote a novel about it that was hugely popular, and a blockbuster Hollywood film came out of it too. But I think it was really influential on his views on agriculture and restoring the soil. Can you talk a little bit about how he ended up there?
Yeah.
And what he learned there?
So yes, so as I mentioned, the garden, he would host these parties every weekend, and it had this kind of like salon-like atmosphere. And among the people that came were these Maharajas and Maharanis, these Indian royals, who hung out and had strawberry shortcake and champagne. And in exchange for the hospitality that Bromfield showed them, they invited him to come to India, stay at their palaces, and go on these elaborate tours. So he takes his first trip in 1933, and he's just hugely influenced by the country in so many different ways. You mentioned the novel that he wrote called The Rains Came, which was published in 1937, a huge bestseller, I think one of his best novels. It's made into a blockbuster in 1939. And it ultimately gives him the money that he needs to build this farm, which we haven't talked about yet, Malabar in Ohio, and we'll get to that. But it's important in just kind of sheer economic terms, but it's also important because it connects him with a guy named Albert Howard, who is considered to be like the founding father of organic agriculture. This is a guy who developed a method of composting called the indoor process, which, essentially it showed a way that you could kind of create something like chemical fertilizer economically using only natural ingredients. And so Bromfield immediately recognized the promise of this kind of and connected it to his experience in his garden in France. And he was deeply inspired by Howard, a real disciple of his. So yeah, India is very influential, and of course the reason he calls his farm Malabar.
Right. So in 1938, with the kind of specter of war hanging over Europe, and he actually stayed there longer than a lot of the other lost generation expats did, but
that's right.
He finally does make this decision to come back to Ohio, where he was raised, and he founds this farm, which is both a retreat for him and his family, but also ends up being this sort of model for other farmers and the real center of his agricultural activism.
Yes.
How did that come about? How did he land there?
Well, so what happens is he had written a novel in 1933 called The Farm, which was a big bestseller. Gertrude Stein thought it was the best thing he ever wrote. And it kind of glorified the agrarian lifestyle of his grandparents, who are Ohio farmers. And, that combined with his experience gardening in France and his excitement about what Howard was doing in India, he had a lot of kind of like heady romantic ideas about the kind of farm that he wanted to build in America. But he was not a student of modern agriculture. He didn't really know anything about it. And he's a novelist. He's a creative guy, and he is not necessarily as deliberate and and considered as maybe somebody should be when they're embarking on a massive agricultural adventure. So he was touring the countryside near his native city of Mansfield. And it was the winter of 1938, 1939. And he finds an old stone farmhouse, and it's got this creek running through. It's like in a valley. There are beautiful tall trees. There's a creek running through the pastures, and he's like, "This is a lovely place to build my dream farm." So he buys the farmhouse. He buys the 600 hilly acres around it, and then the snow melts in the spring of 1939. And he realizes that his land is completely worthless. And he panics, and he finds an agricultural student from Ohio State named Max Drake, who's very bright and who's hooked up with some New Deal era organizations like the Soil Conservation Service that is in the process of kind of transforming eroded, exhausted farms into models for how you can make poor land rich again. And so Drake basically teaches Bromfield the principles of soil conservation. And the farm had this sandy, loose alluvial topsoil that because of wind and rain, had just kind of washed off the hills. There were gullies dug so deep from erosion that you could lose a horse inside them. So the farm was in terrible shape, but through the application of compost and fertilizer, the use of cover crops, which is, typically you would leave a field bare in the off season. But, there was this new idea that you could grow these kind of green manures, which essentially fixed nitrogen and enriched the soil, and you could plow them into the soil, and that would improve the fertility of the soil. So these kind of techniques that are essentially the bedrock of sustainable agriculture today were being pioneered at Malabar in the late 1930s and early 40s. Bromfield, because he came from a farming family, because he loved to garden, because of his experience in India, was just amazed at what was happening to his farm. And it kind of the process of transforming the farm transforms him into a kind of evangelist for what he calls the new agriculture.
Right. He comes back incredibly idealistic. He's an avid New Dealer. He's quite cozy with Eleanor Roosevelt in particular. And that relationship, and particularly his relationship with Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture, evolved over the coming years. What happened there?
So Bromfield was famously impolitic, and he kind of said whatever was on his mind. And he, as you said, was, so far left, he was actually suspected by the FBI for being a kind of communist sympathizer upon his return from Europe. And J. Edgar Hoover actually dispatched agents to monitor the farm. I read the FBI file. It was very entertaining. He wasn't a communist, although he had sympathy for that, especially during the Spanish Civil War. Anyways, he eventually has a falling out with the FDR administration, and it's over food policy during the war. Basically, after Pearl Harbor, the country begins to mobilize, and the farm labor is drafted almost in its entirety. So Bromfield sees, along with other people who are intimately involved in agricultural policy in this period, that there's going to be a huge labor crisis. And he thinks that the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, a guy named Claude Ricard, is just kind of like bungling everything. And he sees that the New Deal has become extremely bureaucratic. Bromfield later becomes kind of a libertarian, and so he hates like governmental red tape. So he begins to kind of like criticize the FDR administration very strongly. And then he becomes the ally of the very people that he had criticized so intensely in the run-up to the war, including some isolationists. So his politics were kind of all over the map, but I like to think that he always sided with the common farmer. And he was, writing articles in major newspapers and magazines. In his column, he was a fixture in Reader's Digest, which was one of the biggest circulation, magazines of the period. And he was basically, advocating on behalf of farmers for better treatment, including during this period, even if it lost him friends. But he was always willing to lose friends to stand up for what he believed in.
Yeah, he was this kind of fantastic gadfly at all, all through his career, actually. I mean, I know that when he came back from Europe, he was an outspoken advocate for the plight of the Jews in Europe, and that was not a popular stance, actually, in the United States at that time, and it sort of fell on deaf ears with the Roosevelt administration. He continued being poking and being a gadfly throughout the war on issues of agriculture. And he wasn't always that diplomatic. There were a couple of pretty funny, actually, and really interesting anecdotes in the book where he really pisses some people off.
Yes, absolutely. So Bromfield, in addition to kind of building this showcase farm, and also writing a series of best-selling agricultural memoirs that began with Pleasant Valley in 1945. He also starts this organization with a couple of other people called the Friends of the Land. And basically they fan out and they're calling for a new kind of agriculture that will make it so that the kinds of things that happened during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression never recur. And in addition to kind of inviting people to Malabar and bankrolling documentary films, and they had an influential journal called The Land, they also went on these barnstorming trips. And Bromfield, because he was so charismatic, and because he was a real farmer, in addition to being famous, was the star speaker. And he would often say things that were kind of crazy. When he was in Georgia, he said, General Sherman didn't wreck your country. You did it before Sherman ever came. When he was in Kentucky, he called the Kentucky bluegrass a noxious weed. So he was not afraid, and in fact relished kind of verbal combat. And I can imagine him today, having 1 million followers on Twitter and really getting into fights and things. He's not the kind of agrarian writer who enjoys pastoral solitude. He's engaged, even though he's on a farm.
Right. I mean, he was traveling a lot during that time. He was going to New York as well. I remember an anecdote from the book where he's holding court at, I think, the St. Regis Hotel, and various, there was I guess it was in the New Yorker, maybe it was Janet Flanner who described the parade of people who came to pay him a visit there.
Yes, absolutely. He knew everyone. And from all walks of life, not only literary culture and agriculture, but politics and the arts, and he brought that life to rural Ohio. I mean, it's very funny. Like ballet troupes would show up sometimes, or there'd be concerts there. Not to mention a host of celebrity visitors, and he, I think for the benefit of the cameras, often had them do different kind of farm chores. So you'd have stories about how Humphrey Bogart was selling vegetables in the roadside vegetable stand, or Joan Crawford was milking cows and things like that. So he was definitely a hound for publicity and quite shrewd about it. But he, I think, used, it wasn't just because he wanted to see his name in print, which he probably did. It was also because it helped promote the mission of Malabar. You know, I think that the typical lost generation artist is someone who like would die for his art, you know. But for Bromfield, art for art's sake literature really became impossible after the 1930s, you know, and he was extremely devoted to his mission, even though he sacrificed a lot for it personally, economically, and in terms of his stature as a writer.
Well, and given the fact, you know, his farm was this model for other farmers, people came there to learn,
Yes.
but it was never a money-making proposition, and he had to continue writing, and he had to continue writing a certain kind of blockbuster to support his work on the farm and to support the experiments they were doing there.
Yes, absolutely. Malabar lost money every year it was in existence. Now, it is, I think, remarkable for a writer to, you know, conduct a commercial agricultural enterprise on that scale and to report on it. That would be, you know, I think that would be enough, even if it lost money. But Bromfield really wanted it to be profitable. And in fact, he frankly lied about its success because he wanted to defend the ideas that he was putting into practice there. And the ideas, I think, were sound. You know, Bromfield was constantly trying out new experiments. He was also living very lavishly. You know, Malabar changed from, you know, initially he wanted to do a highly diversified farm where he wanted to grow everything. And later he realized, oh, this is not economically feasible. So I should, you know, it's not economically feasible, for instance, to grow row crops in hill country and then feed livestock grain. Why don't I do a kind of version of what's today called grass farming, where I grow like deep-rooted perennial crops, which help the soil, right? And then I have the livestock process the yields, which are just the grasses. And that is a much more sustainable model for the type of farm country that he had. But he had the luxury to kind of pivot and explore. He was always doing it for other farmers. He didn't, and he said that anything that he did at Malabar could be done by regular farmers, but regular farmers weren't so stupid. They understood that he had the latitude, the financial ability to kind of try new things where they couldn't. And I think, sadly, because of, not only because of his tendency to change, but also because of his high society connections and the fact that he could be a little bit of a blowhard, some of his agricultural recommendations were just kind of like dismissed by regular farmers who could have benefited from them because of who he was.
Well, he really was quite ahead of his time, including on the issue of, you know, we kind of tend to think of the modern environmental movement beginning with Rachel Carson and Silent Spring in the 60s. But he was raising the alarm about DDT, you know, almost 20 years before that.
Yes, yes. And he wasn't alone in that. I mean, I think that Carson's Silent Spring is really like the result of a groundswell of activity that happened over the 1930s and 40s. And, you know, Bromfield, yes, he wrote an op-ed in 1945, the year that DDT was released for civilian use, basically saying, this is, this is a dangerous substance. We don't know anything about it. And he kind of put his finger on a tendency that we have to kind of doctor, as he put it, a problem, instead of look for the fundamental causes, you know? We just want to come up with some wonder drug to fix something, instead of seeing what the underlying disease is. And later, in the 1950s, the early 1950s, Bromfield testified in front of a congressional hearing about the safety of chemicals in food products. And, you know, they got in all these agronomists, all these chemists, and they were very kind of measured. We don't know if DDT is dangerous. Maybe it's safe. You know, the rats are dying, but if you feed it to young pigs, they seem to be okay. So maybe it's fine. And the senators or the congressmen who are listening to this were getting frustrated. And then Bromfield waltzes in, and he's very unequivocal about it. He's like, "This is a harmful substance. It potentially could cause all these terrible diseases. But not only that, it upsets the balance of nature and begins a kind of arms race with Mother Nature, where you're constantly trying to come up with bigger and more powerful patent medicines, as Bromfield called them, to overpower like the natural resistance that pests or weeds have." So you can see parallels of that same problem now with something like glyphosate, which, despite all of these warnings, is still poured on American croplands at a rate of like 300 billion pounds a year or something. So it's, I think that the DDT case shows how truly prophetic he is in certain respects when it comes to the environment.
I mean, he really is this, he was clearly talented and quite brilliant at various different things. But he also was this person who was sort of, came along at this point in history and happened to be in France and back in America at the convergence of massive historical forces, and sort of one of these figures who's kind of in the right place at the right time. And we talk about that with regard to Fitzgerald and Dos Passos and Hemingway in terms of they went away to Europe and then they got this perspective on both the way the world was modernizing and also on their own country. And I see him very much in the same way as a novelist and definitely as a farmer.
Yes, absolutely. I think that because of his travel, because of his wandering, he gained a perspective that he wouldn't otherwise have. At the same time, you could argue that his whole life was about finding his way home. There's that Thomas Wolfe novel, You Can't Go Home Again, another Lost Generation writer. Bromfield, I think, at least tried to disprove that by going home to his native country and by creating a farm that was at least honoring some of the things he loved about his grandfather's place. But you're right. I think that the distance that he had and the huge historical shocks that he lived through allowed him to see as far as he did into the future. And yeah, it is an interesting transitional moment between kind of, as I say in the book, like between The Grapes of Wrath and Silent Spring. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I also don't want us to finish before we talk about another aspect that wasn't political or academic, his this kind of almost mystical relationship with the land that he had. He truly loved living close to it, and he had some kind of interesting concepts about himself and other people who have this connection to the land.
Yes, absolutely. So Bromfield, one of the key ideas of the book is this notion, this concept called tetched, which is like a rural version of touched, as in like a little crazy. And this word was used to describe Bromfield when he was a boy. It was used by his eccentric, distant cousin named Phoebe Weiss, who's kind of like she's like a hermit who lived in a little cottage outside of Mansfield, and she lived with wild animals, and she had this jungly garden, and Bromfield loved to play in the garden, and he was interacting with the animals, and Phoebe, who who did seem like she had this, almost mystical connection to nature, said to Bromfield's father, "That boy is touched." And, but Bromfield took it to mean something that was actually very special and actually a key ingredient for a great farmer, which is a kind of a sympathy with animals, an intuition about the soil, and feeling as though you're part of the pattern of life. And this is a trait that he sought out and found in all different types of people. I mentioned his cousin. It was also, he also felt it intensely in Edith Wharton, who said that she thought her gardens were perhaps better than her books. She was a extreme nature lover. And he also found it in Doris Duke, whom he had a romance with almost on his deathbed after his wife died. So, that love of nature allowed him to connect to lots of different types of people. And I mean, I really do think that Bromfield loved life in all of his manifestations. Whether you were, a movie star or a French peasant, he loved the raccoon who stole his corn. He loved watching his cattle, in a field of Ladino clover. I mean, he found life exciting and felt connected to it and wanted to make his agricultural and environmental philosophy flow from that kind of deep, visceral feeling.
Well, one of my favorite parts of the book, my favorite part of the book, is the chapter where you go through 4 seasons on the farm. And it's a very intimate, very sensual sense of what it was like, and the real nuts and bolts of the work there too, including like the Westinghouse cooling system he used for the milking cows. But you did that very much based on journal entries, both by Bromfield and his daughter Ellen, right?
Yes. Bromfield's daughter Ellen, who sadly died while I was researching the book, had she was just a kid at the time, but she had a column in the local newspaper called Malabar Notebook. And so she would record the daily life of the farm. And Bromfield had lots of journal entries, some of which went into his agricultural memoirs, but many of them were never published. And some of it was just describing the weather, or him riding the tractor and seeing, the insects that would fly up, so it was that kind of granular detail I thought was important, because so much happens in the book that you don't really get a steady sense of the farm without it. And I think a farm, because of how seasonal it is, it's important to describe it over the course of a year. So yeah, it's this weird kind of arty chapter, which is done in present tense. But it was a risk, but I thought it was a risk worth taking.
Well, I loved it. I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up. But I do want to ask, I know that Malabar Farm was made into a state park after Bromfield's death. Is it possible during the pandemic and today to go and visit there?
Yes. So it's an absolutely beautiful state park, and the park itself is open. I should check. They have a website. Whether the farmhouse, we didn't mention, but Bromfield designed this elaborate Greek revival farmhouse. And during normal times, you can go and visit and see the bed where Bogey and Bacall slept, or Bromfield's office, or the scratch marks on the wooden doors by all of the boxer dogs that he had, because he had like a half dozen boxer dogs running around his house at any given time. But normally you can visit the house. Even if you can't visit the house, the woods and the trails are absolutely beautiful. It's a wonderful part of Ohio. I think it's about a 3-hour trip from Pittsburgh, and definitely worth the trek.
Well, that's definitely my next step after having read the book. Thank you so much, Stephen. This is great, and I really, really adore this book.
Oh, thank you so much, Beth. I really appreciate it. I was happy to do it. Thank you.
How did we not know about this man? Thank you, Beth and Stephen, for sharing your conversation. Stephen, thank you for bringing Bromfield to life so that he can continue to inspire a connection to nature and care for the environment in ways that are both good science and a bit touched. Thank you for joining us. Be well, stay safe, and stay connected. And do let us know if you make the trip to Malabar Farm.